Yea, though I walk through the valley of 3 dimensions, I will fear no UV unwrapping, for you are with me. In my last video, I said I was unsure if I was willing to trifle with 3 dimensional magics, but a comment manifested that emboldened me to delve into the 3rd dimension, and as it turns out, the 3rd dimension is full of peril. I thought starting out, I should make it low res to keep things simple. Instead of having 16 by 16 tiles like I would on a 2D map, I would have most normal size objects be contained in a cube that would have 16 by 16 by 16 pixels on it. I knew I needed to do some research first, so while I was doing that, I had my daughter build me what she wanted out of cardboard. It was really surprising how much of a mental load this took off me. I was a little surprised how few resources I found on the subject of applying pixel art to models in Blender. I saw several references to a plugin called SpriteTile, which seemed pretty perfect, but it turns out that it doesn't work with Blender 3, and it hasn't been updated in almost 3 years. I've learned that open source software ages more like milk than wine, so I went looking for something else. All of which didn't come into play until I was ready to texture my models, so I got to work modeling. Because I was experimenting, trying to find a process that made me suffer the least, almost every piece of furniture was made slightly differently. By the time I got to the end, I had mostly figured out a process that seemed to work for me. Everyone seemed to be suggesting setting the units of measurement off of metric in the world settings, but I found it easier to just keep them at the defaults. I modeled everything such that I was expecting every decimeter to be the equivalent of 1 pixel, so most things ended up being some multiple of 1.6 meters cubed. With this in mind, I turned snapping on, and Blender would keep the proportions I wanted when I was in orthographic view. The main exception for this was the loop cuts. They were clearly following some grid, but it sure wasn't mine. Selecting the relevant vertices and hitting selection to grid afterwards, though, moved my wayward loop cuts back onto the true way. Once things were modeled, I added seams as if this were an overly complicated papercraft. At this point, I noticed that some of my edges had doubled up, which caused wonky UV unwraps. This was readily solved by deleting them both and creating a new one between the affected vertices. I also found it necessary to be perplexed at how wonky my UV unwraps were until remembering that I forgot to apply scale transformation. I did this with every single model. Forgetting just seems like an essential part of the process now. The first plugin I actually started using that I found from my aforementioned research was called Texel Density Checker, and it resizes the UVs in a consistent manner. This was great because I was using big old chunky pixels, and it would be pretty obvious if they weren't all the same size. Because of how I had done my modeling, I set all my UVs to be 10 pixels a meter, which, once I selected my whole UV and hit selected to pixels, caused them all to align perfectly with my intended pixel texture. I made the pixel art in Sprite, which I connected to Blender with another plugin I saw mentioned frequently, Pribumbase. It essentially just updated my textures live in Blender as I was making them in Sprite, and that is the gist of the enchantments I employed for the process. Once I get this project to a presentable state, I thought it might be useful to make a tutorial for this, since there seems to be so few on this topic and no one seemed to be doing it exactly like this. Of course, there could be a reason for that. Let me know in the comments if you think that would be a useful investment of effort. Now that I had gotten all these models made, it was time to import them into Godot. Godot 4 lets you import the .blend files directly, so I decided I needed to get that set up. It was at this point doing development on a Steam Deck added a bit of complexity. Because everything was installed via Flatpak, it turns out that I needed to make a bash script that called Flatpak spawn to run Blender for Godot. This is what I ended up using that worked for me. After overcoming that hurdle, it was time to actually import the models into Godot. I added the collision suffix to all my objects in Blender and saved the file in my project structure. I loaded it into a scene Added a couple of creatures, and this is what I ended up with. I was kind of shocked it worked as well as it did. Well, it mostly worked. There seems to be something amiss with the wall collisions that I'm not quite sure what is. Some of my geometry with the walls is a little wonky, so I thought maybe if I redid the walls that might fix it. I also found having to suffix the duplicate countertops pretty tedious, so I went and searched for a better way. I discovered the existence of 3D grids and so decided to make some new wall tiles using my newfound blending process. The actual modeling and texturing went way more smoothly this time, and I was able to get this horrible wallpaper I designed to align perfectly, even around corners. I was trying to be clever by only doing one half of the wall, thinking I could just line up the other side, but alas, turned out I hadn't thought it through quite well enough. Speaking of cleverness, I need to take a moment to thank my fellow cybermancer who deduced the bug I mentioned in my last video. Thanks to the deep insight of, meh, my critter now stays firmly planted on the swing set. Now that I've gotten through this first experimentation phase with 3D, it's apparent that I'm going to need to redo the whole house, but I'm going to save that for a little later on. What's here is functional, and I found the key to actually finishing things for me is to push for a minimum viable product. Once I have something that's technically complete, I then go back and redo things, add polish, or other not strictly essential features in whatever order seems like it will have the most impact. But you know what would have the most impact right now for this channel? Summoning forth a like and or subscribe so that both I and the algorithm know that people actually watch these. Thanks for coming with me thus far. Until next time.